Welcome to another episode of our video series of the mechanics of human cognition.
Hello. It's great to be here again. With everything going on in the world, it feels like this topic is, well, it's more relevant than ever.
I completely agree. And today, we're really stepping back from the day-to-day headlines. We're not here to discuss specific geopolitical events.
No, not the proximate causes.
Exactly. We're asking a much more fundamental and I think a much more difficult question. Why has our civilization, throughout all of recorded history, only ever managed these brief little moments of peace? Is a world without conflict even possible for us?
And that's our mission today, isn't it? To really get into the cognitive, the biological machinery behind human conflict. We want to look past the triggers, the specific event that starts a war, and dig into the philosophical source code of aggression in our species.
Okay, so let's start right there with that distinction you made. Proximate versus essential causality. When we look at something like World War I, the history books always point to an assassination as the proximate cause.
Right, the spark.
But you're saying that spark only ignites something because the whole forest is already bone dry. The real cause is the condition of the forest.
Precisely. The trigger only works because the essential underlying conditions are already there at a boiling point. And that condition fundamentally comes down to the developmental stage of our species.
What do you mean by that? The developmental stage?
It's a tough thing to say, but the evidence suggests that Homo sapiens, as a species, is still cognitively immature.
Immature how?
In our ability to solve our biggest problems. When we're faced with a serious disagreement over resources, over beliefs, over survival, we haven't collectively evolved the maturity to default to intelligence, to logic, to reason, and sharing.
So instead we default to something else.
We default to the quickest, easiest solution, the path of least resistance. We declare an enemy, and we try to eliminate them.
So war isn't some grand political strategy then, it's more like our factory setting.
It's our default setting, exactly. When anxiety spikes, when our core needs feel threatened, the brain doesn't look for a complex negotiated settlement first. It looks for a simple answer. Identify the threat, label it the enemy, and neutralize it. We just don't have the psychological software collectively to handle high-stakes pressure peacefully.
And that brings us right back to the hunter-gatherer mindset, doesn't it?
It does. Our fundamental instincts, our drives, are basically the same ones we had 50,000 years ago. We are still deeply anxious creatures.
Focused on consumption, trying to guarantee the future.
Always trying to guarantee the future and always prioritizing our own self-interest, which makes the other person, the competitor, seem, well, either worthless or dangerous.
How does that play out in our modern world? I mean, we're not literally hunting and gathering, but that instinct, it has to go somewhere.
Oh, it goes somewhere. It's absolutely fascinating. Our entire modern economic system, this constant drive for infinite growth, for accumulation, it's just a highly sophisticated expression of that hunter-gatherer's anxiety.
You're still stockpiling for the winter?
You're still stockpiling? It's just that the stockpile is now stock options or real estate portfolios. The impulse to consume, to accumulate, to see your competitor as an obstacle to your security, that hasn't changed at all. It's just the primal instinct scaled up to a global level.
Which makes the jump to actual conflict terrifyingly simple. The engine is already running on anxiety and self-interest. You just need a story to tell it where to go.
The story gives it a target and, crucially, a justification. But before we get to the narrative, we have to look at the raw biological component under the hood.
And some of the psychological research here is just, it's staggering. I'm looking at a statistic that says 86% of men and also 86% of women have fantasized about killing someone at least once.
It's a sobering number, isn't it? It shocks you. But we have to analyze that not as a simple moral failing, but as an evolutionary adaptive behavior. For our ancient ancestors, the capacity for lethal action was a necessary survival tool. For defense, for hunting. The key thing to understand is this. If a species has that biological capacity built in, and you add a really compelling story on top of it,
then all you need is a catalyst, a trigger.
The action is just waiting to happen. The story takes that dark, primal thought, which for most people stays a fantasy, and it transforms it.
It turns it into a requirement, a duty.
Precisely. It makes murder, arguably the most miserable action a person can take, into something sacred, something heroic or patriotic. The narrative splits the world into a simple good versus evil, and once you believe you're on the side of good, anything you do to evil becomes justified.
And what's happening biologically that fuels that aggression? The common wisdom always points to testosterone.
The link is definitely there, though it's complex. Testosteronic influence was critical for men in things like hunting and defending territory. There's this great analogy with the rooster. You castrate it, aggression plummets, but then if you give it back even a tiny amount of the hormone,
the aggression comes roaring back.
right? Because the body, the brain, has made its receptors more sensitive. It's waiting for that signal. It's pre-programmed to use it.
So the wiring is baked in from the very beginning.
It is. But here's the massive problem. That biological wiring is now, in the modern world, largely a maladaptive application. It's a bug, not a feature.
Who so?
Because a war today doesn't serve the survival of the majority. It's an incredibly costly byproduct of our old instincts, and it mostly serves a tiny few who profit from weapons, from resources, from the rebuilding. It's an evolutionary leftover being exploited by modern power structures.
So the hunter-gatherer's anxiety is fueling our economic system, and the warrior's biology is being exploited by political stories. And that brings us to how effective conflict is as a political tool for, say, building an identity.
It's incredibly effective. Think about what happens during a natural disaster like an earthquake.
Everybody pulls together.
Instantly. Because there's an external, non-human threat. Creating a conflict with an external human enemy uses the exact same psychological trick. You find a threat to unite people against. The only difference is, one threat is an act of nature, and the other is manufactured, or at the very least, heavily exaggerated by political rhetoric.
And that's why so much political speech doesn't really bother with logic or policy, does it? It's speaking directly to the brainstem.
It bypasses the rational brain entirely. It's all about emotion, primal drives, fear, belonging. Political rhetoric is almost always built on a few key things, constantly talking about some external powers or enemies.
And then pairing that with some grand utopian vision for the future.
Yes, the combination of fear and hope. It keeps the group energized and focused on the fight. You know, political fanaticism, it can't sustain itself just on friends and positive goals.
It has to have an enemy.
It absolutely requires an enemy. The second you get rid of the external enemy, the group's aggression turns inward onto its own internal disagreements, and things fall apart. So for anyone wanting to maintain power, keeping an external threat alive is, well, it's strategically useful.
Which leads to this really disturbing idea about modern conflicts, that they're not always what they seem. They're not always pure wars about one specific goal.
More and more, they seem to be these prolonged, managed, controlled crises. They function almost like a continuous market environment.
Okay, break that down. A market environment. What's the product being traded?
The product is reflexive public opinion. It's attention. Partisanship, this deep emotional need to pick a side without critical thought, is an incredibly valuable commodity.
Wow.
It drives media cycles, it justifies massive government spending on defense, and it's a fantastic distraction from problems at home, whether they're political or economic. The real unspoken goal of a lot of these managed conflicts isn't to win territory, it's to create partisans. It's to lock public opinion into a state of non-critical, reflexive decision-making.
So the moment I decide I'm on this side, without thinking, without questioning,
You've become part of the fuel.
it doesn't even matter which side I pick. I'm serving the function of the war itself just by being a partisan. I'm giving the system the energy it needs.
That is the ultimate cognitive trap. It's so natural to feel like you have to pick a side when you see suffering. But that simple emotional choice is often exactly what the system needs from you to keep itself going. The real challenge is to see the mechanism at play before you get swept up in it.
This all sounds incredibly bleak. I mean, if this is our default setting, how does any society get past it? We have examples. Parts of Western Europe seem pretty stable.
They do. But if you look at a place like Denmark or Germany today, their stability isn't really a story of moral superiority. It wasn't an achievement. It was a compulsory path they were forced down by centuries of unimaginable collective trauma.
The religious wars, plagues, colonization.
Exactly. They basically learned from making every wrong move possible. The sheer scale of the suffering eventually forced a change. It wasn't a choice, it was a necessity.
And that trauma created a new social contract.
It did. It instilled this deep, almost neurotic anxiety about maintaining the order they'd built. That's why you see so much political stress there now, about anything that feels like a threat to that hard-won stability. You know, if we were really a mature species, we'd learn from their history. We'd take the ethics, the structural lessons that came from their trauma.
Instead of just importing their technology and ignoring how they got there.
Exactly. But instead, what we're seeing globally right now, with all this anxiety about resources and change, is, well, it's a massive psychological regression.
People are retreating.
Retreating into simpler, almost childlike belief systems. rigid ideologies, New Age spiritual movements that promise easy answers. It's a classic response to stress. But true human development, true humanization, requires the opposite.
What does that look like? What do we do with all this biological aggression that's still inside us?
You have to turn it inward. You convert that powerful animalistic drive into a struggle against your own negative thoughts, your own prejudices, your own worsened tendencies. The battle, as so many wisdom traditions have told us for millennia, is inside. You have to conquer the hunter-gatherer within yourself.
And the idea is that if enough people make that internal shift, globally,
then humanity could experience a kind of quantum leap in consciousness.
And war would just seem absurd.
Completely absurd. Not immoral, just nonsensical. It wouldn't be a slow ethical debate. It would be a sudden fundamental shift in how we see reality, and external conflict would lose all of its psychological power.
We certainly can't count on the Hollywood solution, right? The idea of uniting against some alien threat from space.
That's a fun fantasy, but it has a huge conceptual flaw. Any real alien race capable of interstellar travel would likely be so far beyond us evolutionarily, it would be like an ant trying to fight an elephant. Conflict wouldn't unite us, it would just make us irrelevant. The only change that can save us has to come from within.
Because at the end of the day, the entire cycle of conflict only exists because of how our minds are built. We think in dualities.
We work by comparison. Good, bad, friend, enemy, light, dark. Our brain needs those categories to make sense of the world.
But that's what creates the separation needed for conflict in the first place.
It is. And that's why the ultimate cognitive shift, the only thing that can truly break the cycle, is achieving what some call unity consciousness. It's a state where those fundamental ideas of I and you, and therefore friend and enemy, just dissolve.
They dissolve into a recognition that we're all part of the same shared existence.
And that recognition is the only foundation for real, lasting peace, both internal and external.
It takes constant awareness. So maybe a final thought for everyone listening is to just reflect on that, on your own patterns. How often you categorize people, how quickly you fall into that role of the partisan.
Because just recognizing that you're doing it, seeing the mechanism in your own mind, that's the first and most important step to opting out of the conflict system entirely.
Thank you for walking us through this. It's a difficult but absolutely essential analysis of our own cognitive patterns, and we hope it's given all of you something profound to reflect on.